Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Okay, so I know you wanted to really get into what was up with those Mexican youth protests back in the 60s, right?
Yeah.
So we checked out that history podcast episode you sent over, and whoa, it's pretty intense.
It is.
Like rock and roll, a super strict government, and tons of people just trying to make ends meet. That's like the whole scene behind this thing.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how this episode digs into the idea that music and culture, something as seemingly harmless as rock and roll can, become a trigger for this huge social and political upheaval.
Totally. Think about it,
Yeah.
Elvis, the Beagles, these guys were making parents freak out and girls go crazy all over the world.
Yeah.
But in Mexico,
Yeah.
it was like they dumped gasoline on a fire that was already, smoldering.
Right, and the podcast really emphasizes that this wasn't just some generational thing, you know? To get why the Mexican authorities were so freaked out about rock and roll, you kind of have to understand the politics of the time.
Okay, yeah, so break it down for me. What was going on in Mexico that made the government so terrified of rock music?
Okay, so the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI, had been in power forever, decades.
Okay.
On paper, they said they were all about these revolutionary ideals, social justice, all that. But really, they were basically an authoritarian regime.
Wow.
They couldn't handle anyone disagreeing with them.
Gotcha.
And they were pros at silencing anyone who, challenged them.
So they were, acting like a democracy, but really behind the scenes, it was a totally different story.
Exactly. And, don't forget, this was the Cold War.
Oh, right.
The U.S. was obsessed with stopping communism.
Yeah.
So they often just kind of looked the other way with the PRI's tactics. They saw Mexico as, this wall against communism in Latin America.
Okay, so rock and roll shows up in this, super tense situation, and the PRI just loses their minds.
Oh, totally.
Right there.
They saw it as this foreign thing, a threat to Mexican values, rebellion without a cause, that whole thing. They even had a Die-Elvis Presley campaign.
Wait, hold on.
I know, right?
Die-Elvis Presley.
Yeah.
That's wild and kind of scary. It seems a little extreme.
Yeah.
Were Mexican teenagers really going to start a communist revolution because of Elvis?
Well, for them, it wasn't really about Elvis himself, It was about control.
Okay.
They saw rock and roll as this, slippery slope to unrest. And honestly, they weren't totally wrong.
Okay, so the PRI goes after rock and roll, thinking they're going to, stop this youth rebellion thing before it starts?
Right.
What happened next?
Well, you can probably guess it backfired big time.
Yeah.
The more they pushed against it, the cooler rock and roll became. That whole forbidden fruit thing,
Totally, yeah.
Plus, Mexican bands like Los Loud Jets and Los Teen Tops, they started blending those international sounds with their own style. They created this, Mexican version of rock and roll, which made it even more appealing.
So it's not just that they're listening to rebellious music.
Yeah.
They're seeing their own culture in it, too.
Yeah.
It's not just some American import. It's theirs.
Exactly. And these coffee houses in Mexico City became, hubs for the youth counterculture.
Oh, wow.
They weren't just, listening to music. They were talking about ideas, reading guys like Che Guevara. It became a whole scene.
So you've got this really interesting mix happening. The global influence of rock and roll, a Mexican twist on it, and this simmering rebellion. It's like all these ingredients are just thrown in a pot waiting to boil over.
Exactly. But, the podcast doesn't just stop at the music.
Yeah.
It makes this really important point that rock and roll was the spark, but the real fuel for the protests came from this much deeper frustration with, Mexican politics and the economy.
Okay, yeah, let's get into that.
Yeah.
You mentioned the PRI being authoritarian.
Yeah.
What were some of the specific ways they were, silencing people and not living up to their revolutionary image?
Well, first off, elections were often rigged.
Wow.
Opposition candidates were harassed, intimidated, sometimes even disappeared.
Oh.
There was widespread corruption in the government.
Yeah.
And on top of all that, there was just massive economic inequality.
So it wasn't just that people couldn't speak their minds.
Yeah.
They were struggling to survive, too.
Right. Remember, the PRI claimed to be all about, helping the working class and creating a fairer society.
Right, right.
But the reality was that many Mexicans, especially indigenous communities, were being left behind.
And then there's the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, right? That seems like a big turning point.
Absolutely. This is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
The PRI saw the Olympics as their chance to, like, showcase Mexico to the world, to prove they were a modern nation. They spent tons of money building stadiums, infrastructure.
Yeah, I bet. They wanted to put on a good show for the world.
Exactly. But here's the thing. While they were busy putting on this extravagant show for everyone else, millions of Mexicans were living in poverty.
So it's this huge disconnect between the image they're trying to project and the reality for people.
Exactly. And for a lot of students and working class Mexicans, the Olympics became the symbol of the PRI's hypocrisy. It felt like they cared more about how things looked than about the real problems people were facing.
Yeah, I can see how that would create a lot of anger. It's like they're saying, look at our shiny new stadiums.
Yeah.
While people are struggling to even, like, buy food.
Right. And this resentment mixed with the anger over, political repression and inequality created this, like, powder keg that was just waiting for a spark. And that spark, in many ways, was rock and roll.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we've got, like, all this frustration bubbling up, young people feeling disillusioned, rock and roll is their anthem, and they're clashing with this government that's all about appearances and not really helping its people.
Right.
And then, boom, the Olympics are about to start.
Yeah.
Talk about pressure.
It's important to remember that this wasn't just like a sudden explosion. The podcast makes it clear that student activism had been growing throughout the 60s in Mexico.
Okay.
There were protests before, clashes with the police, signs that things were heating up.
Right. It's not like everyone just suddenly decided to protest one day.
Exactly.
This was building for years.
So by 68, the PRI, they're already nervous. They know the world is watching, and they really don't want anything bad happening that could mess up their big Olympic moment.
Okay, but at the same time, you've got all these students, all these young people who are fed up. They're not just going to, like, stay quiet, are they?
No, not at all. And this is where the podcast gets really interesting. It goes beyond just describing the protests and really digs into, like, what the students actually wanted. They weren't just rebelling for no reason. They had a plan.
So what were they fighting for? What did they want to see happen?
They had these manifestos put out by the National Strike Council, the CNH.
Yeah.
And they wanted the police brutality to stop. That was a big one.
Yeah.
They wanted political prisoners released. And they wanted basic freedoms like, free speech, being able to protest without getting beaten up.
So they were fighting for, like, basic human rights, the stuff we take for granted.
Exactly. And the thing is, what they were saying resonated with a lot of people in Mexico, not just students.
Yeah.
Workers, intellectuals, artists, even some middle-class folks. They started joining the movement.
It's interesting how protests can sometimes do that. Bring together all sorts of people who might not agree on much else.
Yeah.
But they all agree that something's wrong and it needs to change.
It shows how powerful shared grievances can be,
Yeah.
And that's what scared the PRI. They saw this movement as a threat.
So how did they respond? What did they do when faced with these protests that were, like, growing bigger and bigger?
Well, at first, they tried to downplay it. Like, nothing to see here, move along.
Right, right.
They said the protesters were just troublemakers, unpatriotic, influenced by communists, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
But as the protests grew, that became harder to do.
Yeah, at some point you can't ignore thousands of people on the streets.
Exactly. And remember, the Olympics were just weeks away. The PRI did not want any bad publicity to mess up their big moment.
Yeah, they'd put a lot into those Olympics. It was supposed to be their time to shine.
Exactly. And that's why their response to the protests ended up being so brutal. They felt like they had no choice but to crush the movement.
Okay, so what happened? This is where things get really dark, right?
Yeah. So October 2nd, 1968, just 10 days before the Olympics were supposed to start, there's this massive student demonstration in Tlatelolco Plaza in Mexico City.
Right.
Thousands of people were there, students, workers, families. It was a huge show of defiance against the PRI.
And this is where the Tlatelolco Massacre happened, right? I've heard of it, but I don't know the details.
It's a terrible event.
Yeah.
The government sent in the army and these paramilitary groups, like a secret police force called the Batallón Olimpia, to break up the demonstration. And they were ruthless.
What do you mean?
They opened fire on the crowd.
Wait, they shot at people who weren't armed?
Yeah. They just started shooting into the crowd. They even had snipers on rooftops.
Oh my God, how many people died?
The exact number is still debated,
Yeah.
but estimates range from dozens to hundreds. Many more were hurt or arrested. It was a massacre.
And all this happened just days before the Olympics.
Yes. It was clearly a move by the PRI to crush the movement and make sure everyone knew.
Yeah.
Don't even think about disagreeing with us.
But how could they hide something like that? The whole world was coming to Mexico City.
They tried really hard to control the story. The media was censored, and the government claimed that the students had started shooting first, like it was self-defense.
So they tried to blame the students for their own deaths.
Exactly. But a lot of people who were there, including journalists and people from other countries, they said that wasn't true. There was proof that the troops shot first and that the Battalion Olympia were targeting people who weren't even fighting back.
It's hard to cover up a massacre, especially when there's so many people who saw it happen.
Right. And even though the government tried to hide it, word of the massacre got out.
Yeah.
There was international outrage, but the Olympics still went ahead.
Wow. I can't imagine what it must have been like in Mexico City then. So tense, so surreal.
It was. The Olympics became the symbol of the government's brutality and how far they'd go to silence people. For many Mexicans, the joy of the games was ruined by what happened at Tlatelolco.
So what happened after? Did the protests keep going?
The Tlatelolco Massacre basically ended the student movement. The CNH was broken up. Many of their leaders were arrested or went into hiding. Fear took over.
That's so sad. All that hope, all those young people fighting for a better future, and it just ended like that.
It's a reminder of how powerful state violence can be and how dangerous it is to challenge those in power.
Yeah.
But it's also important to remember that even though the protests were stopped, what happened in 1968 had a lasting impact.
How so? What was the long-term effect?
Well, for one thing, the Tlatelolco Massacre shattered this image of the PRI as a good revolutionary party. It showed the world how brutal they really were, and it planted the seeds for future movements in Mexico.
So even though the protests were crushed, they still changed things.
Absolutely. What happened in 1968 helped to inspire a new generation of activists. They would keep pushing for democratic reforms and social justice. And over time, those efforts helped to weaken the PRI and bring about a more democratic system in Mexico.
It's amazing to think that even with all that violence, the desire for change didn't die.
It shows how strong the human spirit is and how much people want a better world.
It's crazy to think that something like rock and roll, which seems so, I don't know, innocent, could cause such huge political and social change.
It's fascinating, right?
Yeah.
The podcast highlights this pattern that keeps popping up throughout history.
Okay.
The people in charge see these cultural shifts, and it's like they freak out.
Yeah. It's like they saw these kids with their long hair and loud music, and were like, oh no, the world is ending.
Right.
But really what they were freaking out about were the problems that were already there, you know?
Exactly.
The anxieties, the inequalities, that's what rock and roll exposed.
The music itself wasn't the problem. It was what it symbolized.
Right.
Rock and roll was about freedom, individuality, questioning authority, and that's exactly what regimes like the PRI hate.
And this wasn't just happening in Mexico, right? The 60s were a time of youth movements everywhere.
Yeah.
The civil rights movement in the U.S., anti-war protests, the hippie thing, it was global.
It really was a global phenomenon. And the podcast kind of touches on this, pointing out that all these movements, while they were different in their own ways, were also connected.
Okay.
They were all pushing back against the same stuff. Social injustice, political repression, this feeling that the older generation just didn't get it.
So it wasn't just about, like, music and clothes. It was about something much bigger.
Exactly. It was about wanting a better world, a fairer world. And I think that's one of the big takeaways from all this. We need to look past the surface of these youth movements and see the real issues driving them.
Yeah, it's easy to say young people are just being naive or rebellious, but a lot of times they're the ones who see the problems most clearly.
Totally.
And they're willing to fight for change.
The story of the 1968 protests in Mexico is a powerful example of that.
Yeah.
Even with all that violence and oppression, the desire for freedom and justice didn't go away.
It makes you wonder, right? Like, what are the rock and rolls of today? What are the things that are making young people question things and pushing the people in power to, sometimes overreact?
That's a really good question. It makes you think.
Yeah, and I think it's even more important to listen to those young voices.
Right.
Try to understand what they're fighting for.
Yeah, and see how they can help us build a better future. Their voices matter.
I think that's a great place to wrap things up. This deep dive has been so eye-opening, and I bet our listener will be thinking about these connections for a long time.
Me too. What happened in Mexico in 1968 wasn't just a historical event. It's part of this ongoing fight for human rights and social justice that's still going on today.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so important to understand.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.